Hey, welcome everybody to the launch of Rebecca Campbell's Arboreality and The Talosite. The launch is hosted by the publishers of both books, Stelliform Press and Undertow Publications, and is also part of CanCon programming. So for those of you who are attending, who are not at CanCon, CanCon is Ottawa's local science fiction fantasy convention, and it is always a good time. Been off for a few years because of the pandemic, and everything is going along really great at the first in-person con for a while. So thank you so much to CanCon for including this launch in their program and helping us to spread the word about these amazing books by a Canadian author and also supporting two Canadian publishers. So some of us are physically at CanCon, which is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. So please take a moment to consider what this means to be within an unceded territory and how it might change the way we relate to others within this space. So we'll take just a moment to introduce the launch hosts and our featured author, and we'll get started with a reading. So first, I'm Selena Middleton, publisher and editor-in-chief at Stelliform Press. We published Arboreality, and all of our books are similarly focused on the reality of our climate changed world, but always with some speculative element that helps us to link that reality with the hidden causes of the climate emergency and changes that are possible and necessary.
Hello all, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for attending. I'm Michael Kelly. I just would like to say that I'm a grateful settler on the unceded territories here of the Scugog Island First Nations. I run Undertow Publications. We've been doing this since 2009, here and there. We publish strange fiction, weird fiction, genre fiction, and that's about it. We've been a 5-time World Fantasy Award nominee. We've won the Shirley Jackson British Fantasy Award. And we just love publishing good books by wonderful authors like Rebecca Campbell. And I'm going to actually introduce AC Wise, who will be in conversation with Rebecca later on in the launch. So AC Wise was born and raised in Montreal and currently resides in the United States, somewhere in the wilds of Pennsylvania, I believe. Her debut novel, Wendy Darling, was published last June, I believe, by Titan Books, and a companion novel, Hooked, was published this past July, also by Titan Books. Her newest short story collection was published by Undertow Publications, last October, to rave reviews and wide acclaim. I said immodestly. Finally, I'm also delighted to introduce Rebecca Campbell. Rebecca Campbell's Canadian writer of stories and climate change fiction. She won the Sunburst Award for short fiction in 2020 for The Fourth Trimester is the Strangest, and the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award in 2021 for An Important Failure. Knee West Press published her first novel, The Paradise Engine, way back in 2013. And now I guess I'll just ask Rebecca to introduce Arboreality and The Talosite and read for a little bit from each. Over to you, Rebecca.
Okay, first, I want to toast you all and thank you so much for coming. I know that our Saturdays are precious, so knowing that you came to hang out with me for an hour and hear about my stories is a real pleasure. So cheers. I'm just going to take okay, and that was an Ontario cider, if anyone's interested, from Coffin Ridge. Okay, so I'm going to read from each of my books today. I'm going to start with Arboreality, and Arboreality sort of came out of my basic anxiety about climate change and climate fiction as a way to sort of respond to and process that anxiety. It started out a very long time, well, a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, when I was reading an article and found out that one theory for the amazing sound of the Stradivarius violin is that the trees that he used to make these violins was grown during a climate minimum that during one of the little ice ages in Northern Europe, the temperatures dropped, and the trees that grew in that time were of a different texture because the rings were so tightly, because the rings were very narrow, the growth rings. And this was fascinating to me, the idea that you could take, you could look at something as huge, as huge as climate change and find its expressions not only in refugees and rising tide lines, but also in the material, the molecular structure of wood, and not just the molecular structure of wood, but the things we make out of that wood, and just how fundamental that is to us. I grew up in forests on the West Coast, and forests are important to me, especially along the Salish Sea. And so in order to kind of manage a lot of my anxiety about climate change, I started writing about those forests, imagining what could happen to them, imagining what would happen to the people there. It started out with a novelette in Clarkesworld a few years ago called An Important Failure. And then Selena came to me and very generously encouraged me to expand, to find more of the story. And what we ended up with was Arboreality. Now, this novella is super fragmented. That was sort of one of the, fragmentation seemed like the best way to talk about our relationship with climate change, because no single point of view can take it in. Even if you're a highly trained ecologist, even if you know everything about the history of our planet, trying to conceive of the complexity of the system to which we belong and its vulnerability is impossible for a single person. So what I ended up doing was writing a series of fragments. They're threaded through with characters, but for the most part, I wanted a sense of kind of zooming around, of looking at things very, very close up and looking at things from a global perspective. So I'm going to read two fragments from Arboreality. One comes from quite early in the story. And it's a character who's on an international space station looking down at the Salish Sea where she grew up and watching the wildfires. So this is, okay. In Chiangong, Noor passes over her hometown, Victoria, BC, every hour. If there's no cloud cover, she can find the familiar coastline. And for a moment, she can take in the whole range of her childhood and adolescence. Her mother's house and the road on which she learned to drive, first dates, first lovers, excellent exam results, terrible disappointments. The park they hiked when she was 12, where during campouts, she had seen the faint dot of the old ISS. All those experiences enclosed in such a tiny space, made even smaller when she looks over the edge of the earth and sees the rest of the universe beyond. Noor observes the milky gray streams that pour in a gyre across the North Pacific coast. It isn't the color that sets them apart, but their opacity among the otherwise luminous clouds. At night, she can see through the thin spots to long lines of red moving inexorably across the rainforests. That must be Portland, where her parents had lived before she was born. That is Seattle. She'd been at a conference at U of Washington, spoken to pre-med students about the International Space Program. That is Vancouver. She'd flown from YVR on her way to Hong Kong and then Kazakhstan. A man sitting beside her on the flight had said, "It looks like Earthsea down there, all those green islands and the white breakers." She'd nodded, yes, surprised by how right he was. Then the sun had set and the dark void of the Pacific had unrolled around the curve of the Earth, and she had tried to sleep sitting up in her cramped seat, but could not because Kazakhstan was waiting for her, and then who knew what. One morning in November, the third month of her rotation, clouds part to reveal the blackened coastline. She thinks of hungry deer in the valleys and a cougar crouched in the drip line of burnt Douglas fir. She thinks of the sun overhead, a distant explosion that fuels them all, burning her shoulders the day she learned to swim at Sombrio Beach. She thinks of rain. Above Chiangong is a web of satellites run by the billionaires who've collected in the climate havens of Detroit, Cincinnati, Toledo. Oceans climb the coasts and methane belches from the permafrost, but tech bros and their accomplices walk barefoot on native grasses that have been genetically modified to suit both drought and the inevitable summer downpours of the new Midwest. Beyond these refugia, much of the earth below her is dark. The following spring, Noor is back on Earth and working in the new headquarters in Cincinnati. In a photograph of the West Coast, she recognizes the fine, defiant scrim of green growing over the blackened scars. Those are fireweed and blackberries. Those are alder saplings and the reemerging twigs of Gary oak. In the future, this history will be captured through numbers so large they are unimaginable, measured from far away and high above the earth. The hectares destroyed, the people who died and those displaced, the species lost, the rivers diverted. There will be maps recording the greatest extent of the burn, the way we now see maps of the Roman Empire under Trajan. It will, Noor hopes, though she is not naturally hopeful, be a shadow from which will emerge transformed. But looking over the salt deserts in the middle of Australia and the locust clouds over North Africa, she is afraid. So as I said, the story kind of zooms around a little bit. We end up touching down with a couple of characters across this future history, which starts in the 2030s and ends in the year 2100. And one of these characters that we touch down with several times is named Sophie. And she's a woman who was born in the 20s, and she ends up settling in Katsa, which is known as Lake Cowichan on Vancouver Island. And she survives the dark times. She's sort of a through line. And so this is from her point of view. One of the things I wanted to do when I was writing this was not condemn the people who drove the cars and use the plastics and all the things, and not condemn our world necessarily. This passage is about the kind of freedoms that she remembers having as a kid, but which she no longer has because the world has changed so much. And one of the things it does is sort of celebrate the freedoms that you get when you can drive. And one of the things I think about is that future where there aren't cars and there aren't gasoline, and the freedoms people won't have, the flexibility they won't have. So this moment, Sophie is an elderly woman. It's the year 2100. She's in the Cowichan Valley and she's thinking about her past. Once, a long time ago, she'd been a kid in an overheated bedroom, dreaming of silence and cold water and wilderness. And now she was an old woman, and the street on which she had dreamed was probably inundated at king tides, or green with the spill of flooding rivers. Maybe there were new wetlands along Westminster Avenue, where she had often walked to the 7-Eleven, mussels growing over the old Starbucks on the corner, and ducks diving into the shallow waters of the expanding Fraser River. All the arable land and delta salt-soaked, killing the black soil that had accumulated over thousands of years, the strawberry fields, the masses of dahlias and chrysanthemums. She wondered how she'd fallen in love with forests at all, considering they'd been the skyline for much of her childhood. The smoke-whitened haze of Lynn Valley and Cypress looming to the north, streaked with ash. But there had been the patch of grass out behind the townhouse in Ladner, a couple of cedars along the sidewalks dying in the heat. Dad had old Canadian tire buckets from which miraculous strawberries dropped. And in others, he grew cherry tomatoes. The first seed she'd ever planted had been a packet of marigolds he brought her from a dollar store. Some hot night in a too short spring, when the ding, ding, ding from the walk signal on the corner punctured her sleep, her bedroom ceiling painted red by traffic lights. But in the egg carton, little green curls pushed up through the soil, and then, precious and secret, the first leaves unfurling. Frilled orange and yellow flowers she and Dad had transplanted into plastic buckets and set on the step outside their front door. These flowers had glowed and bloomed all summer and into the winter, and she had been so proud. She was surprised to find she missed streetlights, the sound of the walk signal. Not far away, the Pacific Ocean roared on, seeming not to notice the crumbling human world. On winter nights, the rain was incessant and the darkness absolute, but she remembered crowds and the smell of hot fryer fat on summer evenings, the sky glowing under glowing amber long after midnight. Being 17 with a vodka buzz just before dawn while the wildfire smoke filled her lungs. She'd never been hungry because there was nacho cheese from the spigot at the 7-Eleven or shawarma or roti, green patent leather high heels in a shop window, a new lipstick in purple and teal multichrome. For so long, she had endeavored to contain them, but the memories were still inside her. as her body weakened and her mind fractured, pushing up through the soil. Did kids still congregate under streetlights while fires burned across the inlet? What about in Sacramento or Portland? There had been periodic burns all the previous summer, but the breaks they had held around the valley, and the new Orem stands resisted fire even better than the aspen colonies did. The interior mountains of the island were now teeming with gold leaves. She'd had a load of empress trees, the sterile varietal with a few extra fungal resistant genes that grew so fast she thought she could see them move. In a few centuries, they might claw enough carbon back from the atmosphere to drop them back to 2 degrees over pre-industrial temperatures, or not. But somewhere in the world, did kids stand under streetlights at dusk, slapping mosquitoes and watching desultory pickup games on the soccer field? The kids here didn't. They ran out for the secret campgrounds, hiking away from the lake to fuck unstealthily in the woods, buzzed on the spruce beer someone was brewing haphazardly in town. As they should, she told herself. She wanted to know that some kid somewhere drank lychee and rose bubble tea while walking downtown in ridiculous shoes, eyelids glittering purple and silver, staring through brilliant glass windows at the wonder of a restaurant where people in linen drank wine. That the city wasn't dead, just smaller than it had been, and ready to be revived when the world stopped ending. Kit had never been off the island. He was just a teenager when Benno brought him out here to work with Mason decades ago now. He'd been born working, could run a trap line and dress the rabbits he caught and cook them badly over a fire. But he was also restless for stories, for ideas, for the books that Benno gave him. He and Trish had 3 kids by the time they were 25. He was a grandfather now, which made her so many generations removed from the littlest kids, she might as well be an alien, an antique goddess, a relic. The problem was she couldn't control these wandering thoughts, especially at night. She tried to travel backward in time from her years with Jake to her childhood to earlier days even than that. She wasn't exactly asleep, but she could hear her own deep breaths as she saw behind her eyelids a young woman in 1984. How did she know the year? At a gas station. Then she recognized the photograph, her grandmother, 20, the hose and nozzle in her right hand, her sunglasses sliding down her face, her black hair enormous and her jeans tight. She was smiling at someone, not Sophie's grandfather. Her boyfriend's getting a Slurpee inside while she fills the tank of their van. The concrete glazed with oil, chewing gum, echoing with the slap of flip-flops. She closes her eyes while the tank fills and the volatile air around her seems to shimmer with heat and gasoline. The world is brilliant with possibility and speed and distance, tinted orange by the haze over Vancouver as they descend to sea level before they turn south and barrel through Peace Arch Crossing. The names ticking past them: Bellingham, Seattle, Tacoma. The 101 through Oregon, then California, Arcata, Eureka, Fortuna. And she's driving and there's nothing to her right but the Pacific, and she hits the accelerator. He's passed out on the sleeping bags in the back. And she could drive all night like this, the empty road and the stars. But she pulls over at a rest stop, vibrating with 8 hours behind the wheel, the redwoods rising to the south and east, and she thinks this is the most beautiful thing in the world. The engine under the hood, ticking as it cools in a tank full of gas. Mendocina, Gualala, Bodega Bay. 100 years ago, the world was huge and rich and full, like nighttime in California. It smelled like benzene. Okay, so we're gonna do, that was my future history of a climate changed Salish Sea, Pacific Northwest, as you can see from all the place names. This is a different kind of an animal, though I did an interview with Interzone a few weeks ago that made me really understand that there are links between these stories, and I'm hoping we can kind of tease them out. Okay, so Arboreality is a future history. This one is historical science fiction horror. This one really grew out of my the research I did in my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD, which was largely preoccupied with the First World War and the literature that comes out of war in general. And so this one, I'm just going to read from the opening section of it because I think that'll be the best way to introduce everything. And I'm hoping you can get to know the characters and the subject as I read. Okay, so it's 1916. We are on the Western Front, and we're with a couple of Canadian soldiers who are stuck in a trench. And this is what happens. Okay, so part one, Ned, 1916. Okay, just let me get a drink. Ned's first thought was giant, like the giants of Potsdam that Frankie had warned him about. 8-foot Prussians. Kill you when they fall as much as when they jab you or shoot you through the eye. Marksmen too, the advantage of height. Frankie was a barrack room lecturer and often held forth as Ned listened, by turns shocked and amused by all the things he did not know about the world until he arrived in France the year before. The Potsdam giants stalked toward them, lit first by moonlight and then by flares. He must be 7 feet tall, Frankie said. Look at the bugger, 7 feet? And what was he doing in the moonlight like that? A death wish. Bernard will get him, don't you worry, Frankie said. Across the mud, German voices raised in admonition and then panic. Komm zurück, komm zurück. Halfway now, taller and taller. Bernard has him, Frankie said. 8 feet, is he 8? More shouting on the other side and shuffling activity up and down the trench. In the moonlit shadows, he could imagine a helmet raised, a scope. More shouting, another flare. Now the giant was close enough to see a face beneath the helmet, or at least its lineaments. More than 8 feet, Frankie said. Is the blighter more than 9? Then Bernard, in his sniper's blind down the trench, did his duty. A ring, a ricochet. The giant stumbled. Barney, Frankie said. Good lad, good lad. The giant staggered up again, his arm limp, still stalking fearlessly toward them. They're like locomotives, aren't they, giants? Too bad we don't have more like them. Need Irish giants. You know, the giant O'Brien, we need his kind, could take a step. There was a shot. The giant fell 20 feet from their position. Ned could make out the whole man's length, at least 8 feet. The giant O'Brien could take a step and be in the middle of that trench, could stand up here and piss on their goddamn square heads. His cock was, here he grunted and waggled his forearm obscenely. Across the mud, the Germans had settled down, though Ned still sensed the same scurrying activity. The muttered grunts and gutturals, which he did not understand, but which he hated. In that night's wiring party, he crept forward over the parapet and into the wide, open, swampy world, as fear galvanized his skin and knotted his guts around his heart. He had a line of wire to cut east-northeast of their position, which took him within a few feet of the giant. He wriggled over the lip of a shell hole, or perhaps the parapet of an earlier trench, or the body of a horse entangled with the wagon it had pulled to the spot in 1914 before expiring in a shower of earth and shrapnel. Or it might be some ancient garden wall, one never knew. He looked down the slight incline to find the giant closer than he had reckoned. His right arm sprawled toward Ned, naked and rotted and scarred, its skin pale and crossed by the white fuzz of decay, far more advanced than he expected in one who had died the day before. He crept forward again, and by the light of the flares could see the man's face. Another flare, and he thought the giant twitched. For the first time in a week of bombardment and the miserable wait for combat, Ned felt a new kind of fear. He told himself that flares in no man's land will do strange things to soldiers' eyes. But then the giant twitched again. He had to think, did one rescue the monstrous German stranger, or did one abandon him to the deepening mud? He grabbed the giant's arm and pulled, saying, "Come on, you bastard, come on, schnell!" Something snapped inside the German, and the arm tore loose at a kind of seam on the bicep, trailing tendons and muscle into the mud. The hand in Ned's hand stopped twitching. The body it had been attached to did not. Then the whistle of a flare overhead, sparks descending. He pressed himself into the mud, still holding the disembodied hand, knowing that 20 feet away the Hun rose. The first shot, the second, He cursed the early education and self-sacrifice that had led him to reach his hand out to the giant. He cursed the providence that had led him to the spot in the first place, and then he cursed the war itself as the Hun approached, faceless creepers, as the flares continued their descent. A spray of machine gun fire from the Canadians, Bernard, Frankie. He willed himself to total stillness, and in the darkness that followed the flare, he could not tell whether the German soldiers had crept back into their trench or were pressed, as he was, against the forsaken earth. Then someone was beside him, not Frankie, nor Bernard, nor Sarge, too clean to be one of theirs. The unusually clean man said, "May I?" and took the giant's hand from his. He wasn't aware that he still held it, then shoved him back toward the trench. And I think that's my 20 minutes of reading.
Thank you so much. I just love the way that the ideas are sort of mingling between those two books. It seems so different, but yeah, I think that we're going to see through the discussion how similar they really are. So I know that AC Wise has some questions for you, and during that conversation, if anyone in the audience has any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to type them out into the chat. There will be some time afterwards for a short Q&A. If there are any questions left at that point, you are free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you like. So I will pass this on to AC Wise.
Thank you for the wonderful reading, Rebecca, and congratulations again on the launch of these two beautiful novellas. I'm very excited to be able to ask you a couple questions about them and chat with you a bit. And I know we're leaving a little bit of time at the end for a prize drawing, so I will try to dive right into it. You mentioned this a little bit in your intro, how both of these novellas are building on previous projects for you, how the Talosite came out of your research while doing your master's, and how Arboreality came out of an important failure, which was a story that I really loved, by the way. And I love the way you expanded it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to kind of, go back into that research, go back into that story, and kind of build on them into larger worlds.
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're a writer and you spend as many years in grad school as I spent, there has to be something about you that is kind of monomaniacal and that is constantly running over and over the same material. So the opportunity to revisit these stories and these ideas from different points of view was just so valuable. And like I've been thinking about the First World War. I was trying to find my copy of the Regeneration trilogy by Pat Barker, which is one of my favorite novel series. And I think I got it in 1997. So it's been 25 years of obsession going back to Pat Barker with the First World War. And, when you're doing academic work, it's very rigorous. There's a very particular way you can approach texts. And it's very hard on some level to communicate the horror you feel in academic writing, particularly when you're writing about profoundly traumatic experiences. So the opportunity to not only, because I wrote a novel called The Paradise Engine that also draws on the First World War as a kind of thread through it. So the opportunity to revisit what I had learned about the First World War and from reading firsthand accounts, mostly through poetry, and be able to express that through horror, there was something really satisfying about that because it felt right. That the strangeness, the speculative elements of the Talosite on some level feel like they come closer to capturing my understanding of the First World War than whether an academic analysis of it or a straightforward historical would. From my point of view, I'm not saying other people's historicals wouldn't. And so there was something cathartic about that, being able to kind of circle around something that I understood profoundly, or not that I'd spent a lot of time thinking about, but to be able to turn this other lens on it and to keep circling it. And I imagine I'm going to be circling the First World War for the rest of my career as a writer, just because it is a point in history and culture that I keep coming back to as a kind of origin point for the 20th century, as the end of of the 19th century structures in Europe. It's the beginning of the end of a number of empires and the beginning of a number of empires. So, and very similarly, I think in Arboreality, because so much of the stuff I think about climate change is again, kind of traumatic, and so full of dread and anxiety and all of those climate emotions that I know that we're all kind of struggling with now. All those negative emotions, and also guilt too, in a way that I don't think my work on the First World War there's much guilt there. So having the opportunity to sort of repeat that, to keep circling it, I think it only gets richer. And I mean, that's so many writers, right? We're always constantly going back to our core themes, our core ideas, our core anxieties, that kind of stuff.
I love, seeing the way authors kind of revisit, as you were saying, certain themes and, show different perspectives on it. We just had a question dropped into the chat from one of the audience, which I feel like maybe builds a little bit on how, deeply immersed you were in the research and in the period, and, just sort of your sort of obsession, for lack of a better word.
Oh, no, obsession is the right word.
Yeah. And I feel like it's interesting too, because you actually are writing a character who is deeply obsessed, which I kind of want to come back to later in some of the questions if we have time. But I'm going to first convey this question from Sean Henry about the Talosite specifically. And he says, I was struck by how tonally correct your dialogue seems for the First World War. How conscious were you of shifting into that historical voice for this work?
That is a really interesting question. The dialogue there, I think, owes a lot to this historical recording made during the First World War. That's a kind of fictional exchange between soldiers. It's a very, very early recording that I think was done to raise money for war bonds. And so I think on some level, I had those old Scots accents in my mind as I was writing that, and the kind of rhythms of the speech. It's also, if you go back and look at a lot of the commonplace books and the miscellanies that were published as fundraisers at the time, you'll get a ton of dialogue in them. Comics mostly, they'll have a goofy comic, and then there'll be 6 lines of dialogue between Joe and Bob or whatever like that. And probably more than fiction, it was things like that I went to for that kind of sense of the rhythm, or for a sense of how an actual person would speak in that circumstance.
Very cool. And I might want to circle back to more questions about research later, because it just sounds like there's so much fascinating stuff there, but I don't want to, stick too long on one subject. Or, I want to try to get through as many questions as possible. So actually, now that I think of it, this question does a little bit relate to research, but anyways, I love the way that both these novellas have a very sort of like dreamlike feel, but are also very rooted in specific details and rooted in a sense of place. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to sense of place, and, how you kind of think about place in relation to both of these stories. And I think you said, you're drawing a little bit on places where you've lived or visited before. So I was wondering if you could just sort of like talk about that, about the idea of sense of place in fiction and writing.
Yeah. The stories that move me seem so grounded in a completely imagined material world. And that really matters to me, the sense of that a place is physically real. And so with Arboreality, a lot of that comes from the fact that I grew up in the area, in precisely the area it's set. I mean, there's the final scene takes place in Cowichan Bay, which, was, I don't know, 5 minutes away from the house I grew up in. And so there's a sense of, I now live in Ontario on the other side, which feels like the other side of the world. And so there's a sense that in recreating the material memories of those places, it's almost like conjuring it to a certain extent, that you, and I think in the Talosite, one of the things that's always really interested me about war literature, and particularly combat literature, is the idea that the battlefield is this, I guess you call it a space of exception. It's a space where international borders are in debate, where the rules that govern our behavior are suddenly completely thrown out, where it's suddenly okay to kill a guy if you're wearing a different colored uniform. And so that sense of place to me was very important for the kind of story the Talosite was. a place, and if you think about the Western Front, it was so disordered, like villages ceased to exist, roads ceased to exist. They had to resurvey a lot of it so that people could get their property back, simply because all of that stuff had been destroyed. So the Talosite has to take place in this sort of profound soup of chaos that's a physical chaos. And if you think about people buried in the mud, you know, they're alive, but they're buried. There's a kind of life death line there as well. And I think that the stories I love manage to capture that, not by telling you it's a space of exception or telling you that they love the West Coast, but by grounding you in a human eye from 5 or 6 feet off the ground, right? That perspective on the landscape and the things you smell and the things you hear and what it physically feels like to be there. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that definitely comes through, that, you know, you get the sense that this is a place that you've been, that you love, that you care about, and that the characters care about it too.
Yeah.
You did a really fantastic job of conveying that.
No, thank you.
We had another question pop up in the chat, which is actually something that I had, you know, scribbled down for myself as a question too. So I'm going to ask that again with the Talosite specifically. How much was Frankenstein in the background as you wrote, if at all? And if there was any influence of Frankenstein, were you sort of kind of similarly inspired to take on the themes of, you know, the idea of science gone too far, and almost even the idea a little bit of what I referred to earlier, since Anne is such an obsessive character about her work. To me, it almost seemed not directly like this, but almost a little bit of a gender flipped Frankenstein, in terms of, you know, Anne being sort of the obsessive scientist who's almost, you know, sort of removed from the world of human emotion, and then Ned, who she ends up in a relationship, being the more sort of romantic and passionate and almost practical one, which is, you know, often a role that you see women cast in a lot of, you know, these historical novels, or in, you know, just these kind of stories in general. Like the woman's the one trying to like pull the scientist back to humanity, and the scientist is out there going, I don't care, I'm doing it all for the science, I'm going to create my corpse monsters and you can't stop me.
Yes, corpse monsters. I don't think, if you're a woman, or if you're a person writing science fiction, I don't think you can ever get away from Frankenstein. I think she's our everyone's grandma on some level. So, and yes, absolutely. The other, though, you know, I didn't come at the story through Frankenstein. I didn't think, oh, Frankenstein, now I'm going to go to the First World War. It sort of came in the other direction, because I was thinking about soldiers, I was thinking about commemoration, and I was thinking about the idea that you, as a soldier, if you're the unknown soldier, on some level, you, like at one point in the story, Ned says, I signed away my life, I didn't sign away my afterlife. But when you look at battlefield commemoration, and you look at battlefield graveyards, it feels like they did sign over their afterlife. And so I think on some level with the Talosite, I was thinking about the role that soldiers play, the fact that they do not own their own bodies on some profound level, that their body is no longer their own, and extending that to its most horrific limits, essentially. And once I had started thinking about that, about someone who did sign over their afterlife as well as their life, and that's when Frankenstein was sitting right there for me. And yeah, so I mean, absolutely an influence. Like I say, I don't think you can get away from Frankenstein. And also grief, because so much of the book is about grief, and so much of Frankenstein is about grief and about reproduction, and the idea of reproduction, not as because I'm always writing about pregnancy and childbirth and like body horror with pregnancy, because pregnancy is body horror. That it's reproduction that it's not physical reproduction, it's reproduction imposed on something. It's recreating or scrambling material in order to make it into what you want it to be. So does that
Yeah,
that,
absolutely.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, and I love all the parallels that you drew between the idea of sort of like soldiers as, pieces in the machine of war, and
Yeah.
then, their bodies literally being made into pieces of something larger, and the idea of sort of, that they don't own their own lives. But I never thought about that idea of like them being buried in specific military graveyards that sort of like tie them to that war forever, which is a really haunting idea now that you mention it. And I'm never gonna, look at those cemeteries the same.
Well, and also that people couldn't bring the bodies home. So there's a lot of stories from Australia and Canada, especially about people smuggling bodies out in order to bring them back. But they have to be buried en masse, and they have to continue to be doing on the site of their death, and they have to be continuing to do sort of cultural work as memory. So there is this sense that those physical bodies are stuck there and will only mean one thing. And the fact that they standardize headstones too, you have a limited choice. You could add text if you wanted, but everything has to be standardized. This is the only thing you are now on some level.
Yeah, you're not a person anymore, you're a soldier, and that's it.
No, or in my story, you're a giant golem stitched together massive of pulsating flesh.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's really, wonderful the way you explored that in the novel. And now that we've, honed in a little bit on the Talosite, I wanted to shift a little bit and hone in on Arboreality and ask some questions about that specifically. I love the way, in particular, you treat time in this novel or novella, sorry. And you were saying this a little bit in your intro that you sort of, wanted to have that feeling of kind of zooming around and honing in. And I feel like you do that both with place and time. And I was sort of wondering, like, how you conceived of the novella from the start. Do you see it sort of, because you are showing, how very interconnected, multiple lives and multiple ages are, and sort of like, the idea of climate fiction and how one thing affects the other, and, everything we do has lasting impacts kind of for generations, which is sort of a very roundabout way of getting to my question. I apologize. But I was wondering if you did sort of conceive of it in a way as like a series of interconnected short stories or interconnected fragments, or if you sort of had it in your head like as a whole with these characters as a through line and the climate themes as a through line, or if it was sort of a little bit of both.
Yeah. The real struggle at the beginning when I was writing An Important Failure. And I knew that I wanted multiple contexts. I knew that I wanted every act to not simply be the individual, but to be part of something larger. And I wanted people to matter not only because of their individual agency, insofar as we have any, especially during climate change, but as part of flows and history in the largest possible scale. So it was a struggle at the beginning, but I found what I ended up doing was essentially drawing in an omniscient narrator as a way to get a global perspective on the story I was trying to tell. And so the two sections I read sort of almost kind of represent those two perspectives. You've got Noor on this imaginary future space station who's looking down from low orbit, at what her home is becoming. So there's this very large scale. And then there's an individual who's kind of struggling with her own autobiographical memory, her very specific experiences of the world before and the world after, of what she misses, of what she loves. And I found as I was writing An Important Failure, telling my story, telling the basic story, it's about a man building a violin. And so the basic story of this guy collecting the wood and putting together the violin and giving it to the person he wants to give it to. But then punctuating that with this kind of, they're almost function like interstitials. They're almost from outside of the story on some level. And so then when we went forward with Arboreality as a novella, and Selena, I have to thank her. And I haven't thanked Michael either for their amazing contributions to this. Oh, thank you. But anyway, as we kind of worked through this, I realized that what I wanted was was a kind of fractured novella, like a novella that didn't quite line up, that didn't progress as clearly as a novella might, that had sticky outy, spiky bits, that set off in directions that it didn't necessarily resolve. mainly because that seemed, as I said, to be the only way to really capture the complexity of what we're facing. I think I just repeated myself. So, but yeah, but no, I mean, from a craft point of view, it was finding those two voices, finding a voice I'm fairly comfortable with, which is like a limited third, very standard literary fiction voice, standing over someone's shoulder, observing them, their stream of consciousness, all that kind of stuff, and alternating between that and an omniscient voice. That to me, because I really love, my two favorite novels are like War and Peace and Middlemarch, those really big, sprawly, omniscient novels. So dipping into an almost godlike or planetary perspective, a narrator who can know things. Like there's one section that's about that's from the perspective of a tide pool. So the non-human perspective, the perspectives that are outside of this kind of subjectivity. And that was the thing I realized I had to do, was find those voices to find. And once I kind of had a feel for what the texture of that kind of writing, then it started to make its own shape, as I realized. I mean, there was also a ton of stuff that ended up on the cutting floor. Because when you write that way, some of them are almost like prose poems or microfictions and stuff like that. And you just snip and snip and snip until you have something that's got the shape you want.
I think you did a really, really effective job of it. And I feel like it is particularly appropriate for climate fiction because, you know, it is showing that this is sort of a global thing that affects everybody, and you're giving that sort of bird's eye view, but also showing that it is, you know, a personal thing too. It affects individual people, and you're not losing sight of that, the humanity within, you know, something that's such a large scale that sometimes it is, you know, easy to lose sight of it, or to feel like, you know, we're all powerless because it is such a big global thing.
No, and that's
Really nice
exactly
to see
it.
those two sides.
Yeah, and finding a way to kind of conceive of something that's inconceivable. Like, this is why we have the sublime. What we need is we need the sublime here.
Mhm.
Something so large that that we can kind of at least sense the scale of the thing we're facing.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think we probably have time for maybe like one more question, and then I know we're doing the prize draw at the end. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of hope, because both of these novellas, to a certain degree, are, you know, dealing with grim things. You're dealing with war, you're dealing with climate change, yet at the same time, you do have an element of hope that kind of weaves throughout both. Arboreality in particular reminded me a little bit of Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. And sort of the idea of post-apocalyptic fiction that focuses more on community and recovery and rebuilding, and that idea of hope, the idea that humanity will continue and it's not just, you know, grim death and horror all the time. So I was wondering sort of like how you dealt with that balance in both novellas, and sort of, you know, whether hope is sort of, you know, an important thing to you that you wanted to be sure to include in both of these works.
Yeah, I mean, I can't get past or away from the fact that I am and will always be a child of the Cold War, you know, and I was utterly terrified of stories of nuclear apocalypse, which were around a lot when I was a kid. I remember a lot of YA novels about apocalypses. Anyway, so I'm very much formed by that. And also, you know, there might be a thing called depressive realism, which you know, is hard to get away from right now. But if there's something that gives me hope, it's the fact that, like, no material is ever lost, right? It's only ever transformed. And I find something just profoundly hopeful in thinking in cyclical terms. The Talosite is so much about bodies falling apart and becoming something new, something strange, also something collaborative, right? Because the thread that runs through the Talosite is this stuff called Armillaria lazarites, which is a fungus. And it's made up fungus, obviously, that allows for rebirth, but also allows for a new kind of consciousness, a distributed consciousness. And everything we know about fungus is that they're part of this really deep collaboration that goes on a molecular level, on a cellular level, in our forests, in our bodies, all over the place. And that they're about I mean, funguses allow things to rot. They're part of breaking down dead things, but they're also making new things. And that idea of a cycle of creation and destruction, of coming together and falling apart. And the idea that with every iteration of that cycle, you might make something better, that we don't have to go back to what was before. And that if things fall apart, maybe we can make something new. And I feel almost fearful even saying that because hope is, as I say, I am a child of the Cold War, and hope does not come to me naturally. But transformation, I've seen a million times. If you have a compost pile, you know about transformation. If you've seen a child grow up, you know about transformation and transfiguration and the way material can become something new. And that idea of newness coming into the world, I think that's, how does newness come into the world, is the one area where I would find hope. I think that's Salman Rushdie in the Satanic Verses. And it's also like Homi K. Bhabha, I think, it talks about newness coming into the world. And maybe when things fall apart, something new can happen. And that would be the place I would go for hope, that we can make something new.
And I feel like that goes a little bit back to what you were saying before about the idea of sort of the global view. It's like the global time view, like, you know, might not work out for, you know, this particular person or this particular generation, but there's sort of, you know, hope for the larger span of time and humanity as a whole.
Yeah, and that someone somewhere can do better than we did. Like, I mean, that's the hope of a parent, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the hope that we can do we cannot screw up in the same way we've screwed up now, which, yeah, that's about as hopeful as I can get. Sorry, as a angsty Gen Xer, that's the.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all your wonderful answers and for your wonderful reading. And I'm going to turn things back over to Selena and or Mike to sort of wrap things up, to talk about the prize drawing and all of that, where these books can be found so that people can get their own copies. But thank you again, Rebecca.
Well, thank you all so much for listening to me talk. It is an absolute pleasure. It's a long road to get to a book. So a chance to celebrate it is really wonderful. And I see a lot of people I like and have not seen for a while. So it's a pleasure to see your names too.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, AC, for your wonderful interview. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So we're going to give away some prizes now, some books. We have 2 prize packs each. 3 books from Undertow and 3 books from Stelliform Press. So 2 lucky winners, each will be getting 3 books. In the Undertow prize pack, I'm giving away a copy of Naben Ruthnam's wonderful novella, Helpmeet, which we published in the spring this year, and people seem to like it. It's it's actually a good companion to the Talosite in many ways. I'm also giving away a book that's not even out yet. It'll be out in about 3 weeks. It's Cassandra Kaw's debut short story collection, and this is brilliant, so you'll be getting a treat. And something from our backlist is Simon Strantz's Nothing is Everything, beautiful collection of literary horror. And I'll let Selena describe what she's given away.
So we also have 3 books, and the first one, I've selected one from each year that Stelliform has been publishing, which is 3 years so far. So in our first year, is the Crawford finalist Night Roll by Michael J. DeLuca. And then from second year, we have The Impossible Resurrection of Grief by Octavia Cade, and this one just won a Sir Julius Vogel Award for Best Novella, Best Novelette. And then one of our most recent books is The House of Drought by Dennis Mombauer, which is also a weird horror, very appropriate for spooky season. So let's give away the Stelliform books first. So if you want your name to be in the draw, use the reaction button on Zoom. So you can either raise your hand or give a heart or anything you like. And what we'll do is we will have Rebecca pick a number, and then I'll go through the participants list and select our winner. And then our winner can contact us at query@stelliform.press, and then send me your mailing address and I will get the books to you. All right, so Rebecca, let's see, how many people do we have here actually? So 35. Okay, let's say between 1 and 31 because we have 4 hosts here. So 1 and 31.
Okay. 21.
21. Okay. Let's see. So Peter Genoway, you are the winner of the Stelliform prize pack. So you can email me at query@stelliform.press and send me your mailing address and I will get those books out to you. Congratulations.
That's fantastic. Congratulations, Peter. So, Rebecca, I guess you can pick another number. Actually, if anyone hasn't put their reaction up now, you can put your, if you want in, please put your hand up and Rebecca will pick a number and maybe Selena will help me count because my screen's weird.
Okay.
Rebecca, go ahead.
Okay, we're gonna do 7.
Selena, you going to count it for me? I can't.
Oh, yeah.
No.
I'm just
Sorry.
gonna scroll up to the top here for 7. My screen is also weird.
No.
Okay. Andreas?
Andreas, okay. Congratulations, Andreas. Andreas, just send me an email at undertowbooks@gmail.com or visit our website, undertowpublications.com, and send me a note there, and I'll get these books out to you. Thank you.
Okay, so we are at the end of our launch and it's been a pleasure to spend this hour with all of you celebrating Arboreality and The Talosite, which are 2 really remarkable novellas, and I'm so excited for those of you who haven't read it yet to get to read it for the first time. Thanks again to AC Wise for a wonderful interview and for helping us to spread the word about the books and the launch. So be sure to check out AC Wise's books and follow her on social media.
And congratulations again to Rebecca Campbell. If you don't already have a copy of Arboreality or The Talosite, you can grab the links to the Undertow and Stelliform bookstores in the chat. We'll dump them in there. Both books are also available to order anywhere you usually get your books. And if you want to keep in touch with us, updates from Stelliform and Undertow, please be sure to sign up for our newsletters on our websites and follow us on social media. Thank you.
Also, for anyone who's in person at CanCon, be sure to visit Stelliform Press in the dealer's room. And if you did order an Arboreality through Eventbrite, you can pick up your book in the dealer's room at CanCon. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Have a wonderful day.